Good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are. Welcome to this webinar, which is a joint effort by the South Centre and Afronomicslaw. I am James Gavi, one of the editors on Afronomicslaw, and on the screen with us is Olabisi Akinkube, one of the other editors on the blog. So one of the reasons that really excites me about this collaboration is that I really admire the work that the South Centre does, because without the South Centre, we would never know what is happening in Geneva. If you look, for example, at the minutes of any of the meetings of the WTO, they're quite sanitized. You know, they really don't tell you what's really going on, what the stakes are. And I really admire the work that the South Centre puts in to let us know what's really going on and what the stakes in the big debates are. And they've been doing this for 25 years. So huge congratulations. It's really an honor also to be on the same panel with all of you, and in particular, Dr. Correa, who's been in this for a very, very long time. So we are really honored that all of you, Vivian and Daniel and Fernando, are here. Dr. Amaka Vanni, who has published a book recently, a very important book, has really done a tremendous job bringing this together. So I'll hand it over to her so that she can tell us how we shall proceed. So Dr. Amaka Vanni.
Thanks, James. Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Thank you for joining us in this webinar to mark the 25th anniversary of South Centre. Happy birthday, South Centre. Both the South Centre and Afronomicslaw share a commitment to the protection and promotion of the development interests of countries in the Global South. So today's webinar, titled Towards Justice and International Economic Order, Proposals from the South, reflects this shared commitment. An important premise of this webinar presentations will be that the countries of the Global South are not mere spectators in the construction of the global order. And we will see from the presentations from the panelists on some of the initiatives being proposed by the Global South, including, but not limited to, discussion on the proposal from India and South Africa for a waiver from certain obligations under the WTO Trade-Related Agreement on Intellectual Property Rights, TRIPS agreements, in order to ensure that IP protection and IP rights do not impede the ability of WTO member states to access life-saving technologies and medicines, and to ensure rapid innovation and scaling up of health technology needed in responding to the COVID-19 pandemic. Another issue that will be discussed is traditional knowledge and genetic resources in the WIPO Intergovernmental Committee on Intellectual Property Rights. We'll also be talking about the Declaration of the Rights of Peasants and other people working in the rural areas, the rights, the development, and the draft binding treaty on business and human rights. We'll be concluding this webinar with a presentation from Professor Gathi on sovereign debt and related issues that have become particularly relevant in the light of COVID-19 pandemic. And also we're talking about the Afronomicslaw soon to be launched African Sovereign Debt Justice Network. Before we start these exciting discussions, we have a few housekeeping rules. Please mute your mic. Can you hear me? Yeah, okay.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, so please mute your mic. Speakers have 8 minutes to present their papers. The Q&A starts after the presentation, so please use the chat function to ask your questions to the panelists. So let's get right into it. Opening the conversation is Professor Carlos Correa, who is Executive Director of the South Centre and a world-renowned expert on intellectual property, trade, and development issues. Prior to being the Executive Director of South Centre, he was the Special Advisor on Trade and Intellectual Property for the South Centre. He has written extensively and consulted for various governments on these issues, including the British and Argentine government, respectively. He has been a visiting professor in postgraduate courses of different universities and consultant to various regional and international organizations. Professor Correa has advised several government and intellectual property, innovation policy, and public health. He is the author of several books and numerous articles. He's both a lawyer and economist. The floor is yours, Professor Correa.
Thank you very much, Amaka. Thank you also, James, for your very kind words about the work of the South Centre. We are very pleased to organize this webinar with AfroNomics Law. And certainly you have chosen, the organizers, a very important subject. As we know, the international economic order has been mainly framed by developed countries, both in terms of the rules and institutions. The Bretton Woods institution are just one example. So I think it's very important, the purpose of this seminar, in terms of exploring which is the role of the South in shaping the international economic order. So if you allow me a few minutes, I would just like to make a little history of the role of the South in shaping such a system, just the last 7 or 7 decades. Let's start with the Bandung Declaration in 1955, which is mentioned, in fact, in the background materials for this webinar. In this declaration, developing countries made it clear that they were seeking a world in which there was respect for human rights, there was respect for equality of races and nations, the declaration says, and also respect for justice. One important event in these efforts by developing countries to shape an international order that was better suited to the interests of the South was the establishment of UNCTAD in 1964. And following this, the establishment of the Group of 77. This was a real major achievement for developing countries. As you know, UNCTAD was essentially based on the theory of the terms of trade that were deteriorating, the so-called Previs and Singer theory. But the UNCTAD has played a very important role in looking at the interests of developing countries since that time. Then 10 years later, in 1974, there was a major achievement also for developing countries. It was adoption of the UN Declaration on the new international economic order. That was in the context of the oil crisis that started in 1973. This declaration about the new international economic order aim at changing the framework for thinking about development, not just market-led development, but development in which the state had a very important role as promoter of human rights and development. And as you may perhaps recall, or you have seen in the literature, in the context of this declaration, North-South dialogue was started, and certainly a number of initiatives were taken during this period. I will mention some of them, which may also provide the context for the discussion that will take place in this webinar. One of these initiatives that actually started a little early in 1972 was the idea of establishing an international code of conduct on transnational corporations. And this was a recognition of the very important role that transnational corporations already had in the world economy at that time. There was another initiative that started to be negotiated even diplomatically in 1975 for establishing an international code of conduct on technology transfer. There was also an attempt for reforming the Paris Convention on Industrial Property. So these initiatives, unfortunately, did not lead to the cause and the reform that were aimed at, but they showed the capacity of developing countries at that time to elaborate on proposals that will change some of the rules that determine the way in which the international economic order operates. There was, however, a successful initiative, also one that started during that period, and this is the adoption in the context of, under the auspices of UNCTAD, of the set of principles and rules for the control of restrictive business practices, and this took place in 1980. So that was also an important achievement for developing countries, although it is not a binding a binding agreement. And this was, in fact, the intention of developing countries, but at least establish some international rules on competition. Then in 1986, there was another important achievement. This is the adoption of the Declaration on the Right to Development. We are going to talk about this later on. In 1989, the establishment of the Common Fund for Commodities, which is an operative fund, as you know, now established in Brussels. That was also an important outcome of the efforts of developing countries during that period in order to change the international rules that govern the economy. But then in the 1990s, there was a very strong pushback from developed countries with the so-called Washington Consensus. As I said, many of these initiatives they were not pursued at all, such as the Code of Conduct transfer of technology or the Code of Conduct on transnational corporations. And then during the 90s, then the ideology of a very, very strong neoliberal approach reigned. There was a market-led economy, and then the developing countries in many cases were pushed through the reforms and the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank into more liberalization, openness of the economy, and less intervention of the states. And this led in many countries to deindustrialization, opening of economies, and keeping many of the countries, for instance, the case of many African countries, as major producers of just raw materials without any real value added. So the 1990s showed a situation in which developed countries made a very strong, as I mentioned, pushback. We were able to pose a limit to these initiatives by developing countries. Starting with this new century, then we had the Millennium Goals that were approved, although without a clear conceptual basis, in my view. Then in 2007, there was an important achievement in terms of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. In 2010, and we are now celebrating 10 years of the adoption of the Nagoya Protocol, that contains a number of ambiguities. Perhaps developing countries did not get everything that aim at in order to strengthen the benefit sharing component of the Convention on Biological Diversity. But in any case, it was an important achievement for developing countries generally. Then we had the adoption of the 2030 Agenda in 2015. And perhaps one of the latest developments, and Fernando Rosales will talk about this, is the Declaration on the Right of Peasants and other people working in rural areas. This was clearly an initiative by developing countries, led in fact by Bolivia, and Fernando was very much involved in this. So this perhaps is one of the latest achievements by developing countries. As Amaka has said, now there are a number of initiatives which developing countries are trying to get. These include this legally binding instrument on businesses and human rights, in which Daniel Uribe is very much involved. He's following this issue very closely. An initiative also to get a legally binding instrument on the right to development, as it was also mentioned. Developing countries have tried for a long time now, for almost 20 years, to get some results in relation to traditional knowledge and genetic resources in WIPO, but so far this have not been seen. There is another important initiative which is negotiated in New York, and this is about a legally binding instrument on marine genetic resources outside national jurisdiction, which is also very important for developing countries. So in fact, then we have these initiatives now. It will be very important for developing countries to get common grounds in order to support them, in order to achieve other successes, and as it was in the past. There are some processes in which also developing countries need to participate actively in order to make their voice heard. And this is the process of reform of the World Trade Organization, which has been initiated again by developed countries. Some developing countries have submitted also proposal or counter proposal for this reform. It will be very important for developing countries to pursue this. And more recently, there is this also proposal for the World Health Organization. Now there is a non-paper by Germany and France. And again, here, developing countries need to have a voice. So I don't want to go further with this, but this is just to show that there have been achievements, there have been failures in the efforts by developing countries to develop a fairer international economic system. And now there are initiatives that need to be supported, but in particular, I think we need to take, we need to be conscious as those who are working for enhancing the role of developing countries in the international system, that developing countries now account for a large part of the global GDP, more than all the developed economies together. Developing countries account for more than 40% of export of goods in the world. There has been a dramatic increase in the capacity of developing countries to undertake research and development. Now, developing countries account for about 38% of global research and development. So all these indicators need to be reflected in the capacity of developing countries to shape the international economic system and get a fairer system that will allow these countries to grow, to eradicate poverty, to participate in the benefits of technologies, and also to ensure a healthy system. So I think that is very important to recognize that developing countries today are not in the same situation as in the 60s or the 50s when the Bandung Declaration was adopted. And then this enhanced capacity in economic terms, in science and technology, needs to be reflected in what the developing countries do and get in shaping the international economic order. Thank you very much, Amaka.
Thank you very much, Professor Correa. That was really interesting and very enlightening to see how things have progressed, and even for someone that is very pessimistic like me, that things are actually getting better, which I find hard to believe, but it's good to know things are getting better. I have some questions, but I'm not going to abuse my moderator powers, so I'm just going to move to the next presenter, but we'll definitely come back to you with some of the questions we are getting. Thank you so much, Professor Correa. The next panelist, the next presenter is Dr. Viviana Munoz Tellez. She's the coordinator on Development, Innovation, and Intellectual Property Program at South Centre. Prior to joining South Centre in 2006, she conducted research at Queen Mary Research Institute, University of London, on non-governmental public action on intellectual property governance. With over 13 years experience, Dr. Munoz is an expert on intellectual property, health, and biodiversity issues. Her research areas include economics of biomedical innovation, intellectual property, public health, and development policy. She holds a PhD on management of technology from École Polytechnique of Lausanne, Switzerland, and a master's degree in development management from London School of Economics. She will present on traditional knowledge and genetic resources at the WIPO Intergovernmental Committee on Intellectual Property. The floor is yours, Dr. Munoz.
Thank you, Dr. Amaka. I hope you can all hear me well. So what I will be talking about is overall some of the efforts by developing countries to shape international law in the area of biodiversity and the use of its components. So I would like start by saying that a big debate in this area has been the search for justice in terms of the ownership and the control, the exchange, and the use of genetic material, referring to material of plant or animal or microbial or other origin, but also the biochemical compositions of such materials such as enzymes and digital sequence information. So now with sequence data, new technology, also all these are very valuable for their genetic and their biochemical properties. And these important properties are essential in many areas, for example, in the manufacture of medicines, as well in the area of cosmetics, in the area of agro-food, etc. So we're really looking at is how do we actually engage in creating a normative framework internationally where it both takes into account issues about conservation of biodiversity, but also sustainable use, ensuring that these resources are used in a way that are sustainable, but also that can provide gains from a whole range of users and beneficiaries. That includes the countries that hold such resources. So this has been a long-standing debate, and we're not talking about the regulation of genetic material in terms of commodities, for example, just use on trade, if you're trading on oranges or any that might contain generic material, or in plants, just on the basis of trade. We're discussing really about research and experimentation on the advantageous properties and those qualities for scientific knowledge advancement and also for commercial production of goods. And so that's why this is a particular area where there's many substantial benefits to be gained from such exploitation. And part of the debate is really then how are these shared and how do we regulate? So it's a very complex area with a range of players, those that directly manage genetic resources, as well as those who have claims, legitimate claims as well. So not only states, but also, for example, indigenous peoples, a great diversity of users of genetic resources that include for research purposes, such as universities, for taxonomical research, also research institutes, but then there's also the fine line between the research and then the private commercially led projects, because of course there can be a difficulty in tracing when does that research then move or is passed on for then commercial purposes. So of course there's also a number of bioprospecting that's taking place and interest from private companies that operate in diversity of areas such as biotechnology, pharmaceuticals, fisheries, and as I mentioned already, cosmetics, as well as biofuels and nutraceuticals. Now, historically in the 80s, we were coming from a situation where it was considered the common heritage of mankind when we were looking at properties of biodiversity and their exploitation. However, this raised the big question. Well, not all states, not all countries are able to equally collect and then exploit genetic resources. So there was a great imbalance and injustice in the sense of those that would be able to access such resources and then take them, exploit them, but not have to share in the gains of such products. And many times then send these back or put high prices for such products when they have actually been developed with critical material that is found in other states. So with this, we came to the discussion about the Convention of Biological Diversity to also look at the regulation of this access and use of genetic resources from plant and animal microbial origin. Now, so we're discussing the intersection between many areas of law. Just as a background, we're talking about international customary law, as well as trade law, intellectual property law, environmental law, private contract law, human rights law, and indigenous people's rights, among others. So quite complex mix. And so really from developing country perspective, what we have to look for is a coherence, a sort of coordination between all this range of bodies of law, and in that find the right balance of justice and taking into account the different needs of the states. And in developing countries, we tend to be much more countries that are providers or of genetic resources, but most of the countries have limitations in terms of being users. So being able to effectively exploit those resources in particular for commercial purposes. So the Convention on Biological Diversity was then adopted in 1992, entered into force in 93, and it has nearly all universal participation of states, one notable exception being the United States that has not joined. And the objective was really conservation of biological diversity, which continues to be nowadays an extremely important objective. And as we move forward, we know in we're looking for the 2020 ahead framework for biodiversity. The sustainable use of the components, assuming, of course, there's a need to continue to use these resources, but in a way that would be more sustainable. And the third very important element is the fair and equitable sharing of benefits that arise from the use or utilization of genetic resources. And so I will focus looking at the third issue, because this has really been an important game by developing countries, which has been to say, well, we have the right to regulate access to these resources. especially when they're found in our territories or they were derived from the very nature of our territories. So it was agreed that access to genetic resources can be subject to prior informed consent of the provider country unless otherwise the country decides not to regulate. So then an issue is permit, and a permit is issued for granting access. And then conditions can be adopted. So one of them tends to be that there should be benefits that should be shared. And these are defined in specific agreements that are crafted, which are generally known as MATs or material transfer agreements in the case that there's a transfer of the genetic material. And so they specify what are the terms, so what should be the benefits. Now, genetic resources also that underlie the traditional knowledge of indigenous peoples also need to be protected legally under the existing international framework, as well as the well-being of these communities. And this was also stipulated in the CBD. Now, moving forward, then after the experience with the implementation of CBD, it was seen that the implementation of this third objective of the fair and equitable benefit sharing was not sufficiently being realized in the convention so far. So there was a strong effort that was led by developing countries to create a supplementary agreement to the Convention of Biological Diversity. And this was to support particularly that third aspect of the CBD, the fair and equitable sharing of benefits that derive from utilization of genetic resources. So we have since 2010, when it has come to force, the Nagoya Protocol on access to genetic resources and the fair and equitable sharing of benefits that arise from the utilization. And so now we have, now this year we're marking 10 years since it's come into force. And so there's over 100 parties so far, 134 as I might recall to the moment. So definitely we have close to universal participation as well. So what the Nagoya has done, and this is where developing countries had a great gain, is that it has created more specific elements about how to ensure compliance with the CBD obligations and access and benefit sharing with regards to the genetic resources that are covered under this under the CBD. And so when we talk about utilization, it is from the moment that any research is done on the genetic resource up to the moment of commercialization. So regardless if it's non-commercial research that's being done, it would still be an activity that's covered under the Nagoya Protocol so that it triggers the need to comply with any access regulation in a country and then ensure that there's prior informed consent so that there is a permit that has been obtained for adequate access, and that the terms are then agreed, mutually agreed, in order to give rise to those benefit sharings. And the benefit sharing is not necessarily just monetary. They can be non-monetary, for example, assistance to teams in the provider country with regards to research, in the case that it's non-commercial, or it can be also monetary, for example, specifying certain royalties in the case that a commercial product comes out from that research stage. So one important element of Nagoya as well is that it added specific elements about monitoring and compliance obligations for the user country. And this is really critical because we know that many times a lot of bioprospecting does not occur necessarily inside the country that provides the resources, but there is that extraction made collection or information gathering, but then a lot of that additional research activity might take place in a third country. And so it's very difficult for developing countries themselves, or as provider countries mainly, to do that monitoring and follow-up and ensure compliance with this by their users. So let's remember here, this regulation on biodiversity I'm discussing is purely regulatory among member states, so only state parties. Here, there's no direct obligations posed on non-state parties, which are a large part of those that are the users. So here we talk about compliance by user countries. So it required a lot of those user countries to have to provide in their law, even if they don't regulate access to their genetic resources themselves, to ensure that there's compliance with the access and benefit sharing obligations that are from other countries as parties of the convention. So this was a very important gain. And of course, there's a number of potential limitations, as the agreement was, of course, the outcome of long negotiations, and so agreements on text. But a long way forward has been made with the Nagoya Protocol. Now, it's still an issue about effective implementation. a number of countries are still having difficulties in implementing domestically their laws, and then ensuring that the institutions are solid enough to be able to ensure, for example, the monitoring and the compliance, how to issue the permits, which is the institution that does this, how to ensure that this is actually, for example, notified to the international clearinghouse mechanism of the CBD and so forth for transparency purposes. So beyond the Nagoya Protocol, one of the important issues that is still pending that's being discussed, and this is negotiations that are ongoing, and next year we'll have the next Convention of Biological Diversity Conference of the Parties and of the Nagoya Conference of Parties. One of the issues is about how do we treat digital sequence information. And so the CBD and the Nagoya specified that in addition to the genetic material, genetic resources, it's also the biochemical compositions that are included, which is really important, which might not have functional units of heredity, but they're chemicals that are really essential for a lot of products in the different areas I mentioned. But there's still the question about whether we can include digital sequence information or genetic sequence data from genetic resources as part of the scope of the regulations. This is very important because now, to the increased speed and the falling costs of sequencing, there's a lot of biological data that is being produced and it's stored in data banks, and that does not actually require necessarily having physical access to the genetic resource. It might just have the genetic information, but it's really valuable for commercial purposes. So we're missing potential benefits being derived from not including it here. So that's just to mention that's one of the core areas looking forward that developing countries are pushing forth to include as part of the international access and benefit sharing regime. Now, I'll move quickly just to mention that within the WTO and WIPO, which is the World Intellectual Property Organization, there's also related important debates with regards to how to ensure more coherence between the regulation of intellectual property law and then the implementation of the Convention on Biological Diversity and its Nagoya Protocol. So as I mentioned, most member states are party to all these agreements, so intellectual property conventions as well as to the CBD and Nagoya. And so they have to find a way to implement this in a coherent manner. One of the aspects is that intellectual property can be granted just on the basis of what that intellectual property law establishes as obligations, and it does not look at issues related to biodiversity, and in particular, whether there's been any benefit sharing as part of contracts. So one of the efforts that developing countries have been making in both WTO and the TRIPS Council and in WIPO have been to argue that there's a need for an international instrument, in the case of WIPO, on the protection of genetic resources in relation to intellectual property. And one of the main provisions there is to require all patent applicants around the world, whenever they apply for a patent in any national patent office, that they have to disclose what is the country or source of origin where they have taken a genetic resource, including, as I mentioned, a biochemical, a part of the biochemical composition, or as well as potentially digital sequence information, that they would have to provide this information as part of the patent application. And this serves as transparency and helping with the traceability of knowing what potential products might be commercialized as well, where there would be a need to kick in benefit sharing provisions. So you would see, well, this is a user clearly of the resource. Have they actually complied with the access requirements or not? And if not, they would be sent then to the adequate institution.
Sorry, I was just acting on the orders of the moderator, that if you could
close up.
Exactly, in a minute.
Okay.
We'll come back to these other points. Thank you very much.
Yes. So I'll just finish with mentioning then the other area now on this that's moving forward, as Professor Correa mentioned, is with regards to what happens with marine genetic resources that is in areas beyond national jurisdiction. So that means CBD and Nagoya cover any genetic resource that's in the territory of the countries, of the state parties, but not beyond national jurisdiction in the case, for example, of the high seas. And as you know, the high seas and the international seabed comprise 60% of Earth. So this is a big area of saying, how do we ensure that there's regulation here where we have international legally binding instrument that helps conserve and sustain a sustainable use of marine biodiversity, but also that ensures benefit sharing that benefits states that helps also with technology transfer so that developing countries can also access resources there and exploit them effectively. So capacity building and technology transfer are also key demands that developing countries are making now with regards to this new convention that's being negotiated, and it should be concluding next year. So important to give attention within the UNCLOS framework to what is known as this new treaty on the law of the sea context. And we can discuss more details if there's questions later. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Munoz. That was a really, really interesting and packed presentation. I think you're hitting some important points because we have some good feedback on that presentation. The next person to present is Mr. Fernando Rosales. Mr. Rosales is a senior program officer at South Centre. He has ample experience and knowledge on international trade negotiations, since he was Bolivia's main negotiator at the WTO. He was chairman of the Intergovernmental Working Group on negotiating the UN Declaration of Peasants. He has more than 20 years experience in the Bolivian diplomatic service. The floor is yours, Mr. Rosales.
Thank you, Dr. Amaka Vanni. I would like to share with you a PowerPoint I prepared for this presentation. Here we are. So I would like to discuss with you the UN Declaration of Rights of Peasants and Other People Working in Rural Areas, initiative from the South. Peasants play a very important role in our societies as a whole, preserving they contribute to agrobiodiversity, they preserve agrobiodiversity, but also they contribute to food security, jobs creation, in particular for women and youth in our societies, and also they contribute to social and economic development. However, according to the FAO in 2015, almost 736 million people were living in extreme poverty, and most of these people, around 80% of these people, were peasants or people living in rural areas. There were some initiatives along these years to fight against poverty and marginalization and hunger under the UN system, but also outside of the system. And some of them were quite important. You may remember the SDGs as an outcome of the international community to fight against this illness of the humanity. But also there were initiatives coming up from the South, and this was the case of the UN Declaration of the Rights of Peasants that was adopted in December 2018 for the General Assembly of the UN. This was not, it was a process that took about 20 years from its inception in the heart of the La Via Campesina, an organization of peasants that is around the world. And it was this idea to have they had the idea to have an international instrument to protect peasants as well as other vulnerable groups in the world. And they organized themselves, like they had the support of some organizations from civil society. And they took this issue to the Human Rights Council around the 2001. And the first time that the Human Rights Council discussed the situation of peasants at the Human Rights Council was around the discussions related to the right to development. It took about 2008 when the financial crisis also brought the attention of the world again towards the situation of the peasants in the Human Rights Council. And that's the Human Rights Council in 2010 asked the advisory committee to conduct a preliminary study on the right of persons to see what is the situation. In 2012, the Human Rights, the advisory committee study concluded that peasants were peasants and small landholders, landless workers, fisher folks, hunters and gatherers were among the most discriminated and vulnerable groups in the world. Therefore, the international community, in particular developing countries, have the idea to start negotiations to create an instrument to protect and promote the rights of the peasants in the Human Rights Council. Therefore, in 2013, the Human Rights Council created a group, an intergovernmental working group, to negotiate a UN declaration to protect and promote the rights of peasants and other people working in rural areas. In 2018, it was adopted for the Human Rights Council first, and then in the UN Assembly. Successful with it counts about more than 120 votes in favor. The declaration the declaration have 28 articles recognizing civil, political, economic, social, and cultural rights, but also it contains obligations of the states concerning those rights. And to understand better this declaration, we can, there are many ways, but one of them would be if we analyze the contents in two different groups. One thing that the declaration does is reaffirming international agreed rights and standards of peasants that were captured or included in other international instruments. But also the declaration contributes to the development of international law in areas where current norms were insufficient. And all of these previous instruments plus the new rights that were discussed in the core of the intergovernmental working group were gathered in just one single instrument in favor of peasants, with language for peasants specifically. The reaffirmation of existing standards, the more relevant maybe are the right to development, right to adequate food, right to water for all, the reaffirmation also of civil and political rights such as freedom of expression, association, freedom of movement, reaffirmation of the rights of women in rural areas. This was the composition of the reaffirmation of existing rights that were captured in this instrument about using language appropriate for the peasants and other people that work in rural areas. The scope of the declaration also includes not only small-scale farmers or small-scale agriculture, but also people engaged in crop planting, livestock raising, pastoralism, fishing, forestry, etc. But what is also important is the declaration recognizes indigenous peoples and local communities who also perform these activities. One of the more relevant elements of this new instrument in favor of the peasants and other people working in rural areas was the right to land. Right to land has been always a problem, a very controversial issue in international negotiations because it's a very sensitive issue for many countries. It depends on the nature of the legal systems. But the declaration finally managed to agree language in the giving the persons the right to land individually or collectively, including the right to access to sustainable use and manage land and the water bodies coastal seas, fisheries, pastures, and forests therein. Also, they have the right to protect against arbitrary and unlawful displacement, because in the discussions we hear a lot that peasants were many times affected by land grabbing, unlawful eviction, these kind of problems. Another important new development on international law was the right to seats. In the last 30 years, there were a growing tension between the right to seats of peasants, but against the intellectual property rights that were limiting the capacity of the peasants to deal with their own seats and to use their seats and to promote and protect their own practice, cultural practices in the countryside. Therefore, the declaration recognized the inclusion, the right of the peasants to save, use, exchange, and sell their farm saved seed and propagating material, as well as the right to maintain, control, and protect their own seeds and traditional knowledge. Also, the declaration have obligations for the states to protect and promote peasants' agricultural systems. Other important element that that is contained by the declaration is the right to means of production for peasants. Peasants and other people working in rural areas have the right to an adequate standard of living and to facilitated access to means of production necessary to achieve them. States shall take appropriate measures to favor the access, and this includes the means of transportation and processing, drying and storage facilities necessary to selling their products on local, national, and regional markets. States also shall take appropriate measures to facilitate full and equitable participation on markets to sell their products, to allow them to attain an adequate standard of living. In addition, there were some other relevant developments for international law, like the conceptualization of food sovereignty. Food sovereignty has been discussed in many forums before, but there were always a confusion between something that related to protectionism or something, but this is not the idea. And the Article 15.4 of the Declaration captures the concept of food sovereignty in the following terms. Peasants and other people working in rural areas have the right to determine their own food and agricultural systems, recognized by many states and regions as the right to food sovereignty. This includes the right to participate in decision-making processes on food and agriculture policy, and the right to health and adequate food produced through ecologically sound and sustainable methods that respect their cultures. Also, the issue of individual and collective rights was ample. There were interesting discussions there, because Western tradition of rights are not very keen with collective rights, but many other instruments already recognize the collective rights of people in general, and this was the case of peasants, and it was captured in different articles to promote the collective rights of peasants. All these new rights and concepts has just one limitation, and this limitation is captured in Article 28, which expressly says that the exercise of these rights set forth in the present declaration shall be subject only to such limitations as are determined by law and that are compliant with international human rights obligations. Any such limitations shall be solely for the recognition and respect for the rights and freedoms of others. meaning that all these rights should be exercised, and the limits of these new rights should be only when they are affected by other human rights of other people. These are the main components of this the declaration. This experience was very, very interesting for all developing countries that were there participating, because the development of international law is not always an easy thing to do. I'd like to share with you these are my final remarks. The UN Declaration of the Rights of Peasants responded to the demands of peasants' organizations and other people living in rural areas around the world, notably the La Via Campesina. The declaration also represents a landmark achievement for millions of peasants around the world. It provides a human rights framework recognizing people working in rural areas as right holders, notably in the context of the human rights. The declaration is also aligned with international goals and standards and can be supportive of national and international efforts to reduce poverty and fight against hunger. The declaration proposed a different approach and an opportunity to revitalize development strategies by promoting a dignified life in rural areas. The contribution of peasants and other people working in rural areas is central for food security and social cohesion, particularly in developing countries. A final word would be that this declaration was a not simple process, because it entailed the developing of the rule of law for a large but vulnerable group in a context dominated by the more powerful and countries with more resources. But the contribution from organizations from developing countries like La Via Campesina and other organizations for pastoralists, fishers, hunters, helped a lot in the negotiations. And we think that this declaration would be an important tool for them to balance the negotiations when they are going to negotiate in the domestic context, but also internationally, vis-a-vis the current challenges that we have regarding the health and socio-economic crisis that we are facing now due to the COVID in particular. That would be my presentation. I'm very happy if there are some questions to respond. Thank you, Dr. Amaka.
Thank you, Mr. Rosales. That was quite interesting, especially the fact that the declaration also covers the community where peasants live. And it's interesting that it's not only the farmers or those directly involved in this sort of livelihood that are protected, also the community, because a lot of times these communities tend to be overlooked. So it's very interesting that peasant communities have been recognized in an international agreement. Thank you so much for your robust presentation. The next person is Mr. Daniel Uribe. He's the, I'm sorry if I mangled your name, honestly, I'm sorry. He's the program officer of the Sustainable Development, Climate Change and Gender Program at the South Centre. He previously served as a public servant in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Ecuador and as a judicial clerk in the Constitutional Court of Ecuador. He's a lawyer from Ecuador, where he obtained his bachelor's degree from the Pontifical Catholic University of Ecuador, and holds a master's degree in international law from the Graduate Institute of Geneva. Mr. Daniel, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dr. Amaka. Thank you very much for all the participants and all the panelists before me. I think that it's always difficult to start as the last one, given that everything has been already said. But it's also good because I can take advantage of the good presentations that were done before me. And on that note, I would like to take advantage of the introduction that Professor Correa did, which was amazing to contextualize a little bit the efforts that developing countries took during those years from the 60s to the 80s, particularly to the 90s. And I would just like to add that in that context, there were a lot of elements which created this sense and platform of common solidarity, a common interest among developing countries, particularly those countries which were starting or already fighting for their freedom, freedom from colonialism, but at the same time fighting against authoritative or military governments, such as in Latin America and Central America. So given that concept and that context, I think that brings us to why during those periods of time, during those 30 or 40 years, there was a lot of more active engagement by developing countries. We had, for example, as Professor Correa mentioned, the Declaration on the Right to Development, the Declaration on a New International Economic Order, among other ones which encapsulated the effort that the states were taking towards achieving certain kind of equality from new countries forming towards already industrialized nations as Europe and the United States. So without going back to that introduction made by Professor Correa, I will just go ahead and discuss about first the Declaration on the Right to Development, and also a little bit about what is happening now in the discussions on the legally binding instrument on business and human rights, which started in 2014 by a resolution adopted by the Human Rights Council. So in 1986, as Professor Correa was duly mentioning, there was a voting procedure in the United Nations General Assembly, which established the Declaration on the Right to Development. The declaration was actually adopted by 146 countries in favor, one country against. I guess you can know what country are we referring to against the declaration, and eight countries which were abstaining. What is important on the right to development, I think this is the reason of the presentation, is to understand what is the right to development. So Article 1 on the declaration establishes that this is and all peoples. This is important, going back to the idea of community and commonality that Dr. Amaka was presenting before, are entitled to participate in, contribute to, and enjoy economic, social, cultural, and political development, in which all human rights and fundamental freedoms can be fully realized. So here, there are certain elements which are necessary to consider. One is that the declaration recognizes the right to development as a right in itself or by itself, but it also recognizes the right to development as a means for the full enjoyment of other rights. So you have the right to development, but at the same time, development allows you to enjoy other rights. Both of them are working together in a synergy. There is also the conceptualization that it is both an individual right, but at the same time it's a collective right. So it applies directly to the person. The person by itself, by being a human being, has the right to be developed, but at the same time, the population and the peoples have the right to development. And then there is a concept that the right to development is comprehensive, cross-cutting, and multidisciplinary in nature. And those three elements are important, as we are going to see before, because the impact on how you can measure the Declaration on the Right to Development is on the basis on how those principles of comprehensive, cross-cuttingness, and multidisciplinary are actually applied in other declarations or other instruments that took or originated after the adoption of the right to development. I would like to quote only in a brief manner the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, because it actually encapsulates the nature and the spirit of the right to development. It mentions that it is essential to pay a particular attention to the right to development, and that civil political rights cannot be disassociated from economic, social, and cultural rights in their conception as well as universality, and that the satisfaction of economic, social, and cultural rights is a guarantee for the enjoyment of civil and political rights. And this is a response to the disadvantage, I would say, or the disassociation that certain countries try to bring with respect to the idea of having economic, social, and cultural rights only as progressive rights, while civil and political rights were the hardcore of human rights, meaning that without those, there are not human rights at all. So this is a quite interesting response to that particular element of discussion. So in this concept, I think that there are certain principles which are applicable and encapsulate the spirit of the understanding on the right to development. One is that development is centered on the people. The people, the human being, is the center of every effort for development. That will imply that in particularly when you are applying any kind of planning for development, the center of that planning should be based on participation. and the participation from grassroots organizations, for example, peasants, towards more big organizations as communalities and communities. Then the concept that is human rights-based approach, which implies that it is a right by itself. You have to, as an state, you have to comply with the right, and you are obliged to comply with the right of development. But at the same time, it serves as a means for fulfillment of all human rights. And this idea that it's a means for fulfillment of all human rights is quite important because it actually gives space or gives a step or a platform to the discussion of international cooperation. It is, and we will see that a little bit after what is currently happening, but there was this concept that the Declaration on the Right to Development only stated certain obligations with respect to the nation state, and that's it. And the international cooperation, or international community was just left behind. But in this case, the actual meaning or the spirit of the right to development, as we will see, is particularly the idea that international cooperation is required, particularly for making any person or every people part and beneficiary of development. Then we go back to the idea that it's participatory. Having a people-centered development approach implies that the participation is required. Everybody has to participate, not only in the benefits of the development, but also in the planning stages for development. It requires and tries to achieve the idea of equity, which is the fair distribution of benefits among all peoples and all persons. Is based on non-discrimination, which implies that there is no differentiation on race, sex, language, or religion, and strengthens the idea of self-determination, which implies that peoples have full sovereignty on their wealth and resources. And this goes back to what, for example, Viviana mentioned with respect to the right to regulate, the idea that the states should have the right to regulate on their own benefit and the benefit of their people. This brings me to the second question I have, which is what has been the impact on the right to development? So it's a little bit difficult to look at what is the impact of declarations. To our knowledge, there is only one declaration which has been almost recognized universally by all the states, which is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and has actually brought up the idea of the protocols. In the case of the right to development, it has certain kind of impact directly coming from its implementation, but also on implementation of the spirit and principles that the Declaration on the Right to Development actually has. So, for example, in 1993, there is the Vienna Declaration and Program of Action, which was unanimously endorsed by the UN member states, that reaffirms the right to development as a universal and inalienable right and an integral part of fundamental rights. At the same time, during the 2000s, when we were jumping to the new millennium, the United Nations Millennium Summit in 2000 recognized that the idea of fighting for equity and the idea for fighting for a new millennium right was going beyond just a fight against poverty, but it was a fight against deprivation, which includes a narrative of social impairments and erosion of human rights, including those which are covered in the Declaration on the Right to Development. And what is most important is that the Millennium Declaration brought up this idea of a multidimensional perspective of the MDGs towards fighting against a multidimensional perspective of poverty, which is consistent with the idea that the right to development is multidimensional and multidisciplinary, that it not only focuses on one particular right, but it encompasses all rights. The 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, for example, which was adopted by the General Assembly, and we all know, was informed by the Declaration on the Right to Development, and some people actually recognize that it's reinvigorating the implementation of the right to development. But particularly the Agenda 2030 strengthens the principle that there is a need for intergenerational equity, which is going beyond fairness, but it's also encompassing the participation of grassroots communities towards the planning process for the years to come. But at the same time, the idea and the impact that the right to development has in other areas of international law has also been recognized. So, for example, there is a conceptualization on the right to development in the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction. There is a concept of the right to development in the new urban agenda adopted by Habitat 3 in 2016. And particularly during the discussions on disarmament and peace, for example, there have been an inclusion on the idea that all those resources which have been put toward the idea of disarmament has to go towards achieving the project of development, the development of the people, and should encompass the benefits of the population in order to actually achieve the objectives of disarmament. They actually, the last Congress in 1987 recognizes that the resources released by effective disarmament measures should be used for comprehensive development, in particular that of developing countries, which goes in line with Article 7 on the Declaration on the Right to Development. So it seems by this design that there is an understanding of what the right to development is, which shows the value and which shows the concept of the right to development. Nevertheless, currently there is a big discussion on the need to actually develop a framework convention on the right to development. And this is done because there is a multitude of interpretations with regard to what is the right to development and which is actually achieving the right to development. So one of them, for example, okay, so I have to really finish this, but there are two interpretations which are coming, which is one, that for certain developed countries, the idea of the right to development only encompasses the idea of the improvement of good governance and economic management. That's it. So you have to have good governance and a good economic management. But for others, which majority of them are developing countries, is the idea that developing countries should respond to inequalities in the international financial systems. They should have more participation in global decision-making processes, particularly in economic policy, including tax matter and sustainable development, which also includes, for example, the trade and investment regime. Finally, this has brought the role of the non-aligned movement, again, as the leader for initiating efforts to introduce a binding instrument on the understanding on the right to development. But finally, I think that one of the elements which is required is to enhance the capacity of developing countries in negotiations right now. I would like to go with the discussions on the legally binding instrument, but we don't have time right now, so I will be open to discuss that during the time for questions. Thank you very much, Dr. Amaka.
Thank you very much, Dr. Uribe. That was really, really interesting, especially the linking of development with not just in whole, but also to individual people, you know. So we tend to, or rather government or governmental, but tend to lose sight of that when they're implementing or crafting policies on development. So thank you for highlighting that. The final presentation today is by Professor Gatti. Professor Gatti will talk to us on sovereign debt and the soon-to-be launched program at AfRonomicslaw, the African Sovereign Debt Justice Network. The floor is yours, Professor Gatti.
Thank you so much, Dr. Amaka Vanni, and thanks to all the panelists. This has been really very interesting. So I'll not be very long. I like Amaka said, I want to talk very briefly about the soon-to-be launched African Sovereign Debt Justice Network. But before doing that, I just wanted to say that this issue of debt is a long-standing one in the context of the discussion we are having. You know, so for example, in the early 20th century, Latin American jurists like Luis Maria Drago from Argentina formulated what is known as the Drago Doctrine, which was the doctrine that international law did not permit the use of force to compel debt payments. Well, what happened in those early skirmishes, those fights between the rights of private creditors on the one hand and the rights of sovereign states who are indebted to those sovereign creditors, is that system stopped using the use of force, like the way they blockaded Venezuela early in the 20th century to collect on debt, where the state's using the right of diplomatic, the right to diplomatic privilege sort of used the use of force to collect on the debt. today we deal with an entire system of private international law and contracts in particular as the mechanism through which we deal with private debt. And as we heard from Dr. Correa at the very beginning, third world jurists have been at the very center of trying to restructure those rules. And in fact, all the presentations today have really been a wonderful reflection of the efforts that have continued from prior decades of developing countries trying to push back against the norms that are developed primarily in the global north to advance the interests of both the global north countries and the private sector in the global north that far often defines many of the rules that are adopted by countries in the global north. And I think what we have seen in the last couple of decades has been trying to push back against the gains that developing countries have made. So for example, in the trade regime, we see the erosion of preferences and the efforts to negotiate bilateral agreements between global north countries and countries in the global south on the premise that special and differential treatment is no longer a valid way of thinking about the relationship between them. And so it's really great to have this conversation where we are foregrounding the initiatives that have been led by countries of the global south, and to put at the very center the debates, for example, around the rights of peasants, very important, the rights relating to all the issues relating to biodiversity and sort of the real lived experiences of people on the ground, not merely as counter norms to the big norms, but as the way in which the international economic order should be defined. So I think that this conversation really is important in the sense that if one was to teach international economic law in the global south, this is where to begin, rather than the assumptions that often lead many of the materials from the global north that suggest we have to think first about markets and which countries are not following the market norms and what can we do to help those countries come up to speed. So the other point that I wanted to make as a preliminary point is that if you think about the structure of the global economy and the way that the rules give preference to the things that developed countries have a comparative advantage. So for example, in manufacturing and all the things that are protected by, say, the TRIPS agreement in the entertainment or the movie industry, versus how international economic law treats agriculture, which is a comparative advantage for developing countries. It's quite clear that it's a very uneven set of rules. Developed countries overwhelmingly subsidize agriculture in a way that is inconsistent with the comparative advantage of developing countries. And it's almost impossible to use the rules of the trading system to reverse those gains. And the other example, of course, is in international investment law that gives investors rights to sue states in a way that it doesn't give states the rights to sue investors. So these very uneven accounts of international economic law that are the subject of our webinar today are really critical to understanding the stakes involved in all the issues that we've talked about, including on the right to development, which initially was led by some African jurists in its early formulations, and it's great to see the work continuing in that vein. So the other, of course, big issue is sovereign debt, and sovereign debt has been particularly significant an issue in the last several months in light of the COVID-19 pandemic and the fact that many of the economic gains made particularly by African countries over the last decade have been swept by the impact of the pandemic, which certainly raises the question about the sustainability and of course the management of these debts, of the debts that have been accrued by African governments, but not just by African governments, by governments really in the developing world. If we just take one example, just sort of one example from Africa, Zambia, that is currently facing a really, what is really an existential problem. At the end of 2019, Zambia's total external debt was $27 billion, almost equal to the size of its gross domestic product. This kind of unsustainable buildup of external debt by the government of Zambia, primarily from, and it's not just the government of Zambia, this is the government of Zambia plus the private sector in Zambia. So this kind of unsustainable buildup of external debt is really a huge hindrance to any kind of progress in the economy. I saw the Save the Children Fund has a new initiative suggesting, for example, that some countries like Zambia have to make a choice between paying the external creditors and feeding children. And this is the reality. The stakes are that stark. And so when Zambia recently told its creditors that it needed a 6-month interest payment holiday because it had run out of money for various reasons, including the fact that this is an unsustainable debt, but also because of corruption in Zambia. So we have to name that and we have to recognize that as well. It was quite clear that not just Zambia, but many other countries are likely to be at the verge of default. And the types of default that we might see as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic and all the other problems that I have mentioned are likely to be as catastrophic as they were in 1980 when Mexico declared that it didn't have money to pay, which led to the debt crisis of that period. It's also quite clear that there is lack of clarity about the debts that countries like Zambia have taken. We are not, it's unclear, for example, whether there was any compliance with the domestic law there in terms of whether there were any ceilings and whether or not those were extended in a way that sort of allowed that kind of a debt to be accrued to the extent to which it has been accrued. And this is really instructive, the question of compliance with domestic law. We know that in countries like Mozambique, a combination of activists and civil society leaders successfully sued within Mozambican courts the Mozambican government for failure to comply with domestic law in accruing certain loans, and that they were very successful. They were successful in invalidating loans that had not followed domestic law in terms of approval by parliament, among other things. But that was not the end for those Mozambican loans, because those bondholders then went to English courts to enforce their loans under, of course, doctrines such as the sanctity of contracts that makes it very difficult for Mozambique to have a valid defense. In any event, the other big issue here is whether countries like Zambia, and I'm just using Zambia as an example, have followed things such as the soft law principles, such as the UN guiding principles, the Equator principles, the UNCTAD principles on promoting sovereign debt, responsible sovereign debt borrowing and lending. And this is the context, my time is up, in which Afronomicslaw has teamed up its academic credentials, if we have any, with many civil society groups in Africa, about 10 civil society groups. And we are going to be launching what we are calling the African Sovereign Debt Justice Network, with a goal, as I said, of combining the kind of work we do here on the blog, but with civil society groups. Writing one more article, I think BC would agree, is not sufficient. We have to be out there, like the South Centre has been advocating for the types of things that surround this issue of debt, in terms of creating awareness and elevating this issue of sovereign debt and its importance through things like this kind of a webinar, but also engaging African governments. And finally, also trying to get some of the best research out there in conversations with church leaders and others about the importance of making sure that this issue of sovereign debt is addressed both at the domestic level, but also by private creditors. So you'll soon be hearing a lot about this coming up in a couple of weeks. And we hope that the South Centre and other people who've sort of been following the activities on the blog will be helping us to sort of loudly articulate the issues around sovereign debt. So thank you very much, Dr. Amaka Vanni. I'm sorry for going over by about a minute.
Thank you very much for your presentation, Professor Kathy. So I hand over to BC now, who will take the Q&A. But before I do, I'm going to use my moderator prerogative and ask questions to Professor Correa. So Professor Correa, could you talk more about the India and South Africa waiver proposal to the WTO and what that means for access to medicine, especially access to COVID-19 medicines? Thank you. BC, you can take over from here.
Yeah, of course, Amaka. Well, as you know, the TRIPS agreement, the agreement on intellectual property that was negotiated and is part of the WTO organization, imposes a number of quite tight obligations on all members, including developing countries, in relation to the grant of patents, the grant of protection for test data, trademarks, copyrights, so on and so forth. And in particular, in relation to access to medicines, access to vaccines, access to equipment that is necessary to deal with COVID-19, patents and other intellectual property rights may create an obstacle for people in developing countries to get access to such resources. So that's why India and South Africa have made a proposal to the Council for TRIPS in order to get a waiver for the obligations under the TRIPS agreement, which includes, for instance, granting a patent, enforcing a patent for 20 years, and allow then all countries, in particular developing countries, to deal with this crisis, health and economic crisis, in a manner that will not be conditioned by the enforcement of intellectual property rights. So this proposal was submitted a couple of weeks ago to the Council for TRIPS. It got a lot of support from a number of developing countries. As you could have expected, there was opposition by developed countries. Some of them argued that intellectual property do not create any obstacle to access to medicines, vaccines, or other equipment. Therefore, there was no agreement. However, there was substantive support from a large number of members of WTO to consider the issue. Then the chair of the Council for TRIPS was given the mandate to continue consultations in relation to the waiver, and eventually to have another meetings in order to consider it. So let's see what is finally decided on this. Let me just add that another alternative that members of WTO may have is to invoke Article 73, paragraph B of the TRIPS agreement, which relates to national security. So this is a general exception that may be used in cases that, as it is now with COVID-19, there is an emergency, an international measure, in fact, and therefore members of WTO can suspend their obligations under the TRIPS agreement if needed, in order to respond to this crisis.
Okay. Thank you very much. BC, I can see you've been putting up some questions. Do you want to take over from here?
Yes, I'll do that, Amaka. Thank you very much. And maybe to also just say that thank you very much to all our participants. We do note that we are 5 minutes away from time. We tend to keep to time in our webinars, so I'll ask you to kindly indulge us for a maximum of 10 minutes to take the questions we have that have been posed already. The way I'd like this to work is to just pose it to all the panelists, right? So that we can then determine the order in which we go without me needing to intervene again. So there's one for Professor Dr. Tellez, which I think you should go first, which is already there. I will be implementing this at least 2 minutes maximum to these questions. Then we'll come back to Professor Correa with the next question there. Both questions were posed by Kimani Goddard, who's one of the participants in the audience. Then to all the panelists is the question from Brittany Vilhoa, who I think sent it by email prior to today. So I'll just leave that to 2 or 3 of the panelists to choose who wants to respond to that. There's one for Professor Gathi specifically. So James, I ask you to not chime in on the all panelists question because you have one for you. So more appropriately, Fernando or Daniel, that would be awesome. And then James, you have 2. Okay. All right. So Dr. Tellez.
So I saw the question addressed for me was to what extent have developing countries or LAC countries taken steps to begin creating bioinformatics databases? So as far as I have knowledge, most of the bioinformatic databases right now are concentrated in a relatively small number of countries, in particular United States, UK, Germany, Switzerland. There are some collaborative efforts, though, that involve also a number of developing countries, but overall, the majority is still in the developed world. And one of the big issues is, you know, on the one hand, the accessibility of such databases. So some of the databases are held by private companies. So then the access issue is also about what are the conditions for access. There's others that are done by research or university institutes. And then the question here is, you know, can there be favorable access as well for developing country researchers to access? And a second overall issue was the one that I mentioned with regards to the ABS regulations and how they can be applied effectively to ensure that there's a good balance between maintaining access for research purposes to that information contained, but at the same time that it does comply with the ABS objective of ensuring benefit sharing. So those are 2 points. And I would just highlight perhaps that in terms of an example of one collaboration, at least that I own of, is the International Center for Biotechnology and Genetic Engineering, the ICGB, that does have a number of hostings in different developing countries. So it does have countries in Latin America, as well as some Asian and Africans, of course. A couple of countries as well. Then I think South Africa in the African region has done some efforts here on this area, but I wouldn't be aware of many others to give as examples. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Professor Correa.
Yeah, thank you. The question is about what opportunities for influencing rules do you see in the current WTO talks to establish an investment facilitation agreement? So let me just say in the first place that this is one of the so-called joint initiatives. This is not a negotiation that is taking place with all members of WTO. It is so far what some people call a plurilateral. But the fact is that a large number of developing countries, including many from Africa, do participate in these negotiations. So I think there is a significant opportunity for developing countries to influence the outcome of this negotiation. Interestingly, for instance, the United States is not interested in this area. One of the reasons for this, perhaps, is that the United States, there are regulations and limitations for foreign direct investment. They are also increasing, in fact, in the European Union. The European Union is now enacting new regulation, and this is also done at the national level in Europe in order to prevent some companies from being taken over by foreign investors. In particular, they say they are afraid of because of national security concerns. But in any case, I think there is some room for developing countries to shape the rules. And in fact, Fernando Rosales, our colleague of South Centre, is following this very closely, and he may provide more details if needed. Now we have no time, I understand, but he may be contacted because he's studying this issue in detail.
Thank you very much, Dr. Correa. Just because Fernando was invited in that, I'm happy to say, okay, if you want to just supplement that with any thought, and then you can then come in on the other question, that would be great.
Yes, thank you. I just would like to say that, as Professor Correa said, not all developing countries are participating in this initiative, and they're creating a framework that may affect all developing countries because the characteristics of WTO. But there are some elements that are maybe facilitating, but there are some other elements that may affect the capacity of regulate of developing countries or countries in general participating that require some care about how to affect this process. It's in this moment that there are it's not so easy to see how we are going to resolve this issue of participation or no participation on this initiative, but certainly that there is something that is being negotiated there that developing countries should take a detailed reading of what is going on there. No? I just want to say that this moment.
Thank you very much. So I take it that, did you want to come in on that question for everyone?
Yes, yes, I can say something as well. What I see in my experience in negotiations is that one of the weaknesses of developing countries to affect the processes is usually regarding the capacity of participation in two different ways. One of them would be we are not always present in all negotiations, and second is the overcapacity to affect negotiations in a substantive manner. That's why the work of institutions like South Centre or Afroeconomics are important to create a capacity in negotiators to affect the processes in a way that maybe the outcomes are beneficial for all developing countries from a South perspective and not being only following what big developed countries are creating a new legal system that many times affect negatively developing countries. That would be my answer. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fernando. Indeed, the substance of our engagement is critical. Daniel, did you want to comment on that as well?
I think I would like to answer this looking at the issue of South-South cooperation. So the South Centre worked with the Islamic Development Bank on a particular review of the ecosystem for South-South cooperation. And one of the pillars on South-South cooperation is the link with connected actors, implying the issue of participation and accountability of different elements of the society with respect to the participation in with the participation in negotiations. That implies that there is a need to, as Fernando was mentioning, of create this kind of cooperation among academics, civil society, and also communities with respect to what the role of the state is in international negotiations. We have seen that, for example, what is happening now, and it has been multiplying by the situation of the digital diplomacy, is that the idea of closed rooms for discussion has been multiplying through Zoom meetings, through WhatsApp meetings, which actually makes the participation of developing countries less and less and less. That on the one hand, also on the issue that developing countries do not have the warranties to actually participate in all meetings which are happening now on the internet, because the platforms and the infrastructure is not enough. So they are limited in the participation in these global affairs. So one of the mechanisms in which you can create this kind of cohesiveness and coordination between what is happening in Geneva, what is happening in New York, what is happening in Vienna, what is happening in Bonn, with what is happening at the capital. It's through the process of creating this kind of networks, as Professor Gatti was mentioning, the creation of networks with civil society organizations, with intergovernmental organizations serving developing countries, with academics, and with people on the ground might actually help not only in the issue of autonomy, but also on the issue of accountability and participation. So I think those elements can be taken on board. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much for that concise, response. And I realize here that, we're running through these, but it's just trying to keep to the conscience of timing that we also indicated to our panelists. Professor Gatti, you have 3 questions, I think. So we'll let you have a little more than 2 minutes to combine the responses.
Okay, thank you. I've just posted on the chat something that I wrote a couple of years ago that I think will help answer. I think there are 2, one was repeated twice. The question, very good question from MJ Marvel, since I don't want to fall foul of BC's time rule. So the question was, what is the usual dispute resolution mechanism agreed by parties in sovereign debt cases? And there are 2 very important clauses in sovereign debt contracts that relate to that question. The first is the forum selection clause, and the second is a choice of law clause. Often, creditors don't want to deal in the courts of the borrower, so they choose in the forum selection clause a forum like New York or another friendly jurisdiction like in the English courts. And of course, for the choice of law, they also choose foreign law that is very favorable to them, that under which there is decades of experience. So, for example, that might be New York law or laws in some other place where the creditor might want. The problem so the disputes are not when there is a dispute on default, the disputes are not often resolved or even enforced in African jurisdictions or in developing country jurisdictions. They are enforced abroad, where, as I've shown in that article written a while back, the law has really moved in a very friendly direction in favor of creditors. And all the defenses that were traditionally available to sovereigns, including legitimate defenses, perhaps including corruption, have become impossible to plead as a defense to some of those claims that you raised regarding corruption. So unlike in investor-state dispute settlement, where tribunals have shown some readiness to use corruption as a defense, in the sovereign debt context, that hasn't been the case, because simple default is sufficient to give the creditor the right to enforce. So we can say more about that, but I guess I don't have enough time. The last question about options that developing countries have to remove agricultural subsidies. This is a really difficult one. I think that moving away from the WTO is the wrong decision for many developing countries. The collective action they can get in terms of getting their wins in the WTO is really critical. Developed countries, once they break the alliances developing countries have in the WTO and in other multilateral forums, can really get the kind of deals they want and sort of perpetuate things like the agricultural subsidies that are really inconsistent with both the rule and the spirit of the Subsidies and Countervailing Measures Agreement of the WTO, as we have seen also in the negotiations around the fisheries subsidies. The rules are also written in a way that is not very friendly to developing countries. But I guess we can continue that conversation in another forum. I think we are running out of time. So back to you, BC.
Okay, thank you very much, James. I mean, what is clear is that one webinar is never enough to discuss Global South issues. And so one hopes that this is only the beginning of many, many other conversations along very different issues. Just 2 things, and then I think we'll be in a position to really conclude properly. There's one question which Dr. Vanni has sent. Even if I had all, I don't think it would be fair to have that right. So I have put that out there for all the panelists to look at and chime in. Two things, and then I'll hand over to Professor Gathi for the purpose of our participants to conclude this session, is that on Afronomicslaw, a couple of things in addition to the Justice Network will be coming up. Symposia on tax issues, on global value chains, book review, Dr. Amaka's and others as well are in the pipeline. So we do hope that you continue to keep up with us, and thank you very much for all your support. And most importantly, joining us today. Thank you to all our panelists as well. James, over to you.
Thank you so much, BC, and thank you to our audience. You've been very patient, and thank you so much to all the presenters today, and to Dr. Amaka Vanni for helping put this together, and to everybody at South Centre. I hope this is the first of many to come. We look forward to continuing to work with you, and we are delighted that you are now at 25 years. We have a lot to learn from you as well, as really a baby in these matters. So we look forward to having your help as we continue with the things that we plan to do here at afronomicslaw.org. So thank you, everybody. Have a good rest of the day or evening or morning, wherever you are, and looking forward to many more like this. We shall make the video available as well in the next couple of days.